Thank you very much, Danielle, and I'm very glad to be here. I'm sorry to say that despite a PhD in French literature, written in French, um, uh, my French is very rusty, and I have never worked in this field in French. So I'm going to speak in English, but I'd be happy to take any questions in French. And I've got friends here to help if I don't understand everything. So I'm here to talk about something that I didn't realize was, until last night, was going to be as relevant to you as it might be. The census is certainly a peculiar animal because, unlike the surveys that we normally analyze, it does two unusual things simultaneously. It counts all the people and it places them where they live. And if you're running a census, you have to think that way. Count and place, count and place. It's the two of them go together. It's a two-handed survey. In countries that maintain a regularly updated population register, that's relatively easy to do, but that isn't us. It isn't Canada, it isn't Australia, it isn't the UK, so we do it differently. I plan to cover these 5 challenges. These are what I consider the key challenges from the point of view of the US Census, with some references to Canada. I have a little less envy of Canada than I did the last time I went to Toronto. Had a lot of envy then. I'm hoping this broad overview will encourage discussion, so please, I'm not here to deliver any particular message. I'm here to discuss, and so interrupt me at any time, ask any questions, clarification, make comments, but this is sort of where I'm going to head. The most important challenge in the US, now I don't know how this plays out in Canada, is funding over the census cycle, because the census cycle these days encompasses at least 15 years, maybe more. And you start spending money before the previous census, doing your planning, and it just sort of rises and rises and rises to this big peak around census day, and then it comes down for the 2 or 3 years that you're doing evaluation, distributing the data. Now, the problem is that we have an annual budget and appropriations process. And yesterday, the Huffington Post, which is a blog some of you may be familiar with, had a piece on how our current census planning in 2015, that's what we were in fiscal 2015 now, how that contrasts with 2005 and 1995. 1995 was my year. And because you see, now we are rising up toward that peak, and we need a lot of money now in 2015 to fund the research that is going to let us meet congressional objectives, which is doing as good a job at saving money. Well, guess what? The House of Representatives right now is planning to give us 5% of the total census budget, compared to 35%, or 36% is what I got in 1995, and 30% is what they got in 10 years ago. The census would give us more. They would give us what would be 29%, so it's still less. But guess what? Changes to the census-taking environment require new methods, and you have to research them, and you have to test them before you can use them in the census, and this needs to happen now. So my colleagues and I, my colleagues meaning 6 other former Census Bureau directors, Republican and Democrat, in charge of censuses starting with 1970 to right now. Our letter is what inspired the Huffington Post to look into it, and there's been other people writing about it, but it hasn't hit the major papers yet, and I don't know whether we're going to be able to get that to happen or not. But I mean, this is just silly. The reason we need to work so hard on this research and development is that you may or may not have thought about it this way, but the single biggest variable cost of taking the census is in that temporary labor that you have to hire in the census year. When I was taking the census, I had like 10,000 employees at the whole Census Bureau, but of course we do a lot of surveys and whatever. So maybe I had 5,000 working on the census. Well, we acquired 95,000 more in the census year. And we have to train them and have all the papers for them and the procedures and oversee them and whatever. And I sent them through security, increasingly difficult security, to make sure they're going to be all right. And that's a lot of money. So that is where we can bring costs down. The current charge to the Census Bureau is to conduct the 2020 census at the same cost as 2010, not adjusted for inflation or reflecting the increased population. So to do that, we would have to really have some, pretty clever improvements, and we'll just not be able to do them if we don't get this money. What happened in the last census, they were one of the it's not just working on reducing the response follow-up, but it's also on all the procedures that go into it. They were testing using computer tablets for the enumerators to put things so they would go right into the computer, and it failed because Congress did not give the money in time to research it in time, so the test didn't work. And then there was not enough time left to keep testing, and so that whole thing didn't happen. Well, when the senator in charge of, Democratic senator in charge of census oversight right now was asked about our letter, she said, why do they want money now for some expensive technological boondoggle that fails? So in other words, not to do what we, not to get things that are going to work. They're not going to give us the money, so we'll have things that fail. Anyway, so I think that's really the big issue, is the funding for the research and the testing, because things have to be tested in a census environment. If you're going to do an operation this large, as you know, it's very, very large for any country. I did have one personal success as a demographer. We have some demographers here. I have to say this, it had nothing to do with technology, just thinking demographically. When I was in charge of the planning for the 2000 census, I said to them, I said, look, we can't keep doing it, hiring people the way we've been doing it. They've been hiring people to work full-time, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. I said, more and more people are not at home during the day. We have smaller families and more women working and more people without children at all. And so we're not going to be able to do that. Plus, in 2000, we had two very unusually small cohorts in the ages of where the Census Bureau usually hires temporary employees, which is new retirees and young adults who are not yet fully employed. So we had the baby bust of the Depression years was our new retirees in that year, and the baby bust of post-1964 when the birth control pill came in. That was our generation of young people. So I just told it all up, gave them the figures, went to the current population survey, said, look, there are not enough people in these two cohorts for us to get the people we need. So what we did is we, again, did research, did testing, and hired a firm called Westat to help us figure out what wages we would have to pay in 4 different types of areas around the country to get the kind of people we needed. Well, the unexpected result was we sent money back to the Treasury after the census, because what happened was when we were now offering part-time jobs, evenings and weekends, we got all these people like teachers who had some free time and wanted to make some extra money. So we had this big increase in labor quality, which meant that there was far less turnover, far less training, far less use of materials, retraining, whatever it was, more and less hiring. Anyway, I kept saying at the time, I know this is going to be a good dissertation topic. I wish somebody would work on it, but I don't think anybody did. Anyway, it was a big success when the money went back to the Treasury. Okay, so that's really my biggest concern right now. But this is something that I know is relevant to you right here. This is a perennial challenge, the needs for data versus what respondents might consider burden. And it goes back to Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, Benoit. I know you wanted to hear this. That was the 1800 census. Thomas Jefferson, who was our second president, who was the author of the Declaration of Independence, was our first census director. He directed the census of 1790. And that went on for 5 or 6 censuses. The head of the Department of State actually was the census director. So Thomas Jefferson was not there anymore for the 1800 census, and he hadn't been elected the new president yet. So he wrote a 4-page paper. It was 2 sides of 2 pieces of paper, and I had the privilege of holding it in my hand. It was a letter to the Congress, and he was at that time president of what would have been the precursor of the National Academy of Sciences or the American Association for the Advancement of Science, something like that. And he wrote a letter saying, you know, it would be good to ask these questions. And you read down the list of questions. It'd be good to know what people produce, what the nature of their products are, how much money they make, how they are educated. And he goes on and on and on. And we'd all say today, yes, that would all be good. Well, he went to the Congress, and John Adams, who became our third president, responded, that's only good to make a book with. And was completely opposed to the idea of data and information. This is not the business of the government, and so they didn't have a long form. That was, just want you to know, Jefferson was the father of the long form for the United States. And you may or may not know the United States is the world's oldest continuous census. So we've got it's a fascinating history. It's almost a history of the country when you read the history of the census, written by a historian called Margot Anderson from the University of Wisconsin. So in recent years, I know this word intrusiveness is not unfamiliar to you, but I didn't know it when I was making these notes. Certainly in our country, conservatives and libertarians have been active in resisting what they call government intrusiveness. At the same time, in recent years, census data has been increasingly in demand for making database decisions and for accountability for programs. So since they are place-based, the census data are really key to allowing government agencies to plan and to evaluate, to monitor and evaluate all the programs they have. And they also use them for allocating resources, again, for programs. And these are programs that mostly the conservatives don't want to have. So it doesn't matter to them that if there wouldn't be any data for it. But the resistance from those opposed to gathering information beyond that required for electoral purposes gained a lot of support starting about 20 years ago in the United States, because the 1990 census costs went way up and the response rates went way down. And they went down even more for the people getting the long form than they did for the people getting the short form. It was actually only 5 percentage points difference, which if you look at the whole thing is not that big a deal. Well, anyway, so we started getting this noise about the long form being a really bad thing and being the reason that we had all these costs. So it was clear that trouble was coming. And I directed our lawyers to work with lawyers from several different agencies, because we gather the data in the long form. Census Bureau gathers for Department of Education, Department of Transport, so on and so forth. So we got all those lawyers, all worked together, and they all researched the legislative background for each one of the questions. And we said we will only put questions on the long form that are either required or mandated. By required, it means specifically required the census will collect da-da-da-da-da-da, or mandated, meaning this data is mandated to be gathered, but you can only gather through the census because it was place-based. Okay, so we got all that, and we eliminated questions that were not required or mandated. There were very few of those questions. The most prominent one that caused the most trouble was the question on national origins or ancestry. What is this person's ancestry? And a lot of people were very concerned and disturbed by this. So they came to me and I said, you'll have to get a congressman you'll have to get the Congress to mandate it. And they did. They got 17 different nationality groups together. I remember sitting in a room at the Italian embassy with it was the Irish American lady and the Italian American woman were the two that really led this effort. But there was these sort of Croatian soldiers around the table and Serbs and, just for all these different Turks, all these different groups that really cared about knowing the national origins. And they went and I talked to them and said, you're going to have to find yourselves a champion. They found a champion, a senator from Nebraska, I think it was, maybe it was North Dakota. He's Lebanese, of Lebanese origin. And he got together and he founded a Congressional Ancestry Caucus, and lo and behold, they passed a bill. So that's how the ancestry question got back on. And it was really good to have this legislative thing, because what we do 2 years before the census, we submit to Congress what's the questions that are going to be on the form. A year we spec the topics, then the exact wording goes in a year. 2 years, the topics go 3 years beforehand. And so we sent the exact wording ones. We sent a binder, and every question had a page. At the top of the page, it had all the legal things you would look at. If you were a lawyer, whatever the legal language is for every different statute that required whatever. And then we had said what the data was gathered for, what it was used for, what the history was, how many years it had been on, and so on and so forth. And we delivered them to every member of Congress. Well, in 1998, we had another election, and the Republicans, there were a lot of new Republicans came in, and they were of this intrusiveness thing. And every time I would go to meet them, the first question I would get from them is, why do you ask such intrusive questions? And my answer was always, because you told us to, and I would hand them the binder, and here's where you can see where it all is. Well, I went one day to meet with a new congressman from the state of Washington, and I said, because you told us to, and handed him the binder, and he didn't take the binder, and I said, well, he said, well, I wasn't here then, when those laws were passed. So I just handed him the binder, and I said, well, you've got your work cut out for you, because you'd have to pass laws to get rid of all those requirements, and because there's no way it would be cost effective to do another means of gathering the data. What we did do, because we saw all this trouble coming, we moved the census long form onto something that's called the American Community Survey. And that is a continuous census. In fact, it was called the Continuous Measurement Survey originally, until it was rolled out to the public. And it was developed actually around 1990 by a man called Roger Harriot, who there's an American Statistical Association gives the Roger Harriot Award every year for ingenuity among statisticians. And Roger was a cowboy statistician of the first order, and he worked with a man called Leslie Kish, who was at the University of Michigan. I used to babysit for his daughter when I was a little girl because I lived down the same street. Little did I know that I would meet him in later years. And Leslie had come up with this idea of a continuous census. And what we did in 2000, we had the long form, and I got it. I was so thrilled. I got the last long form. It was wonderful. But people, they were quite surprised when I was jumping up and down. They came, anyway. Oddly enough, the director of OMB, Office of Management and Budget, told me he'd never gotten the long form, and he was quite disappointed. So you never know who's going to like these things. We ran the 2,000 long form, and we started the American Community Survey about 2 years earlier, and then we just gradually added sample and ramped it up so that we could then we could go at 2010, we could go off, not have any long form at all. So our situation right now is that the intrusiveness people want to make the American Community Survey, they want to make the response voluntary, not mandated. You all know about that. So that survey just now, again, seeing trouble coming, did the same process of reviewing all the questions and the necessity for them, and they're having comments, advisory period comments coming in and so on and so forth. And they are proposing to remove the marital history question. I think that's the one that's most dear to demographers, but that's that. Anyway, so as a result of all this, the short form census only asks the questions that are needed for elections. That's your basic demographics, age and sex, and it asks for, but it also asks for race, ethnic identification. This is what's controversial now. That's because race and ethnicity has a long and very checkered history in our census. You may or may not know that 100 years ago, the census taker was instructed to look at you and to say and to write down if they thought you were mulatto or quadroon or octoroon. I mean, this is just by inspection looking at you and writing that down. That went on for 1910, 1920, 1930 censuses. But we went, in 1940, we went to self-identification, self-reporting. And of course, many of us spent a lot of time looking at all this stuff and thinking about it. But it has a history going way back to the very beginning of the census. The census actually came out of the Constitution, constitutional compromises, and the big compromise was over slavery. And as a result of the compromise, it was decided that in the census, a slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person, even though they didn't get to vote. And as a result of that, the South held power in the federal government until the Civil War, and things were changed. So anyway, the government's rationale for getting this identification in the 21st century is that we are still seeking to protect and remedy past injustices for what are called underserved minorities. But other people want to have the groups that they identify with counted also, like particularly Arab Americans. And but they are not underserved minorities, but they are really politicking and trying to get themselves included in the census. And there's, fortunately, the Office of Management and Budget oversees all this requirement, so we can just say, oh, we just do what OMB tells us, even though we do all the research for them and provide them with all their staff. The point is to make the requirements uniform across the whole government. Whether they're used for demographic or statistical purposes or not. It's very political, and it's a whole story in itself. Just as one example, Asian Americans, we only need data on Asian Americans because of the history of how we treated Asian Americans up until after World War II. But Asian Americans don't say, I'm an Asian American. They say, I'm Chinese American, or I'm Japanese American, and they identify with their group. And this is true for Hispanics also. So we, in essence, have forced them into saying, I'm Asian American, or I'm Hispanic American, just because that's what we're going to use for our policies and programs. Well, we actually get better data if we don't let people fill out their subgroup membership. We've done a lot of research, and it's higher quality data. But politics comes in, and before the 1980 census, after the forms were printed, after these millions and millions of forms were printed, two Japanese American congressmen from California threatened legislation Well, if they'd done they could have gotten the legislation through, but we folded first because we don't want legislation. Legislation, you really want to avoid legislation for anything statistical because times will change. And that legislation is going to lock you into something that isn't going to be good or relevant or even appropriate, in 20 years, 50 years, whatever it is. So what we always do is we fold. When it's clear that some senator or representative has the votes to get a bill through, we fold. And it works out best. But so that you may find anomalies sometimes in a data series, and this is the explanation for it. After the 1990 census, we had a whole new system for defining metropolitan statistical areas. And but the people in Kansas City, parts in Missouri and parts in Kansas, realized, oh, well, when they came to ask us 4 or 5 years ago, did we want to be one MSA or did we want to be separate? Maybe we shouldn't have said we'd be separate, because what happened was they fell out of the top 50 media markets. And that meant they were not getting advertising they would have gotten. So we want to be together. They went to their senator, Senator Dole. He was the leading Republican in the House, and Senator Dole was going to legislate it. Well, that would have affected a lot of places. I mean, it would have been a mess. So we just folded and let them be their separate people. So we really have this problem with with racial and ethnic identification. My final example is that what we do now, the form really has quite a lot of categories, because you can put down, you can check your other category, but it can't have everybody. I mean, it will go on for pages. Lots of Asians, lots of Latin Americans. So then there's an other category, and then we have to allow them to write in the category. We may or may not tabulate it, but we've got this other category. And what we do is we give examples of the other category so they know what we mean by other. There's a huge fight over which ones get to be examples and which order they get to be in, because the ones that get to be examples are going to that will boost their numbers, and the one that gets listed first, that's going to boost their numbers even more than the others. So that's a big fight. So I'm not sure how they're resolving it now. We'll usually do something sort of first in, first out, or some rule of thumb like that. And it's just a big pain. And then we have the Taiwanese, and of course that would cause fights with the Chinese, and it's just there's a lot that goes into doing a census. And it doesn't change, because you look back through history, they've always had it like this. It's just the names change, not the emotions. Well, the response rates are really what determine census costs and census quality. And I know with what just happened to your long form, you're aware of this. I was talking to several people last night about the impact of that happening to you. The bottom line is, if you get your form in the mail and you fill it out and return it, or on the internet, or however you do it, it doesn't cost hardly anything. It really is just a very small amount of money. But if we have to send somebody to your home to follow up, and if we have to do it 4 and 5 times, I think we go as many as 6 times. I hear you cut it off. Well, you guys have been cutting it off earlier and doing some some sampling, if I recall. At least that's what we talked to Ivan about years ago. But you don't go back as many. We go back and back and back. And then if we still don't get you, we ask the postman or the neighbors. We start with the neighbors. Do people live there? Yes. Do they come, and we get any information we can from the neighbors. Well, is it a married couple or whatever it is? And we get any information we can. We fill that in. And then we fill in the remainder by having the computer loop back to the last house in the neighborhood on that street that we got information from. We just drop that information in. So the thing is, we found that we get better quality data when people do respond for themselves than we do from having the person go to the house. And, there's a lot that goes into why that is. That's a whole interesting area of research. But we did plan to use statistical sampling in the 2000 census to truncate this response follow-up. We wanted to go back like 2 or 3 times and then sample from within each small neighborhood and to me, and you know, we did, you know, we researched it. We got numbers that were just as good, if not better, than doing what we do, the multiple return visits and then the what's called hot decking imputation, that sort of thing. But Congress passed a law against it. So that was that. And then we said, well, it's going to raise the cost of the census. And I remember a Cuban-American congresswoman from Miami saying, oh, they always say costs are going to go up. But, you know, if you have to hire more people, costs go up, right? I mean, it's really very simple to, you know, to explain the cost. But some people, there's willful ignorance is often a good thought. Well, ideally, we try to approach every household the same way to avoid bias, but that can be self-defeating in causing us to miss hard-to-count households. So that is always that's always a tension. It's always there. It's a perpetual challenge. The homeless are certainly an extreme example. I don't think people worried about the homeless in, 50 years ago that they were being lost, but they sure worry about them now. But the cost pressures are still driving all these changes in the census processes for reaching people the way they live now. And I don't know what you all have done about the internet, but we have not allowed census response on the internet before. We are going to do it now, and they've been testing it quite a bit in tests that were conducted just this year. The thought is that we could reduce census costs by as much as $5 billion if we by conducting it on the internet, potentially. But what was interesting is this most recent test. They tested 2 things. One, how is using the internet as a way to contact people before the census? You know, we send out a big mailing telling you the census is coming. Well, what if you got just an email? So we asked people how they would like to be contacted prior to the census, and actually only about 3% of households said they would prefer to be contacted by an email as opposed to the standard mailing. However, as a response option, we tested that, and in the response, 81% of people who were self-responders, now these are the good guys, these are people who are going to respond anyway, said they would rather respond by the internet rather than by mail or phone. Well, there's just a lot more research that has to go on to make this possible. We have to be confident that it's not going to get hacked or whatever. Privacy concerns, all that. So that's one of the reasons we really need this testing to continue and to be funded. Meanwhile, an interesting new thing that we've just done, the Bureau held a crowdsourcing competition for ideas on how to best model places where low response is going to be likely, like your empty Saskatchewan area. It turned out we got a guy from software developer from Maryland had the winning idea, and he had the winning model. It had 342 variables, all of which are available in our planning database, and he used data mining and machine learning techniques. And so we're planning to use this to develop tailored strategies to increase self-response, ideally in these areas, and also to make non-response follow-up more efficient. Again, this is going to take more research, more testing before this promising venue can be explored. Well, this is a real sore spot for me, data accuracy. I led the effort to adopt the statistical methods that Canada, Australia were already employing in the census to correct for both undercount and overcount, and the British were doing it the same time we were. We met every 6 months with our colleagues in the UK to sort of compare notes and see how their census is a year later than ours. I think theirs the same year as yours, they got theirs through. We didn't get ours through. I remember when they did report their census results, a lot of articles in the British newspapers saying made up people, which were the sampling created people. And you know, there was all that fuss, which we would have gotten to, but anyway, everybody quieted down after about 2 weeks, and I've never heard anything about it since. So the Brits are over the edge, and they've got to do this. Well, we didn't get to do it. Congress prevented us from implementing our plans, and they did that. Well, here's a funny thing. When we got, I was in the part of Bill Clinton's administration. I was in the first administration. When the Clinton administration got to the Department of Commerce, where Census Bureau is a part of, they found in the files a letter from 8 or 9 senators from from South and Southwestern states asking the Bureau to adjust the census for the undercount. They were all Republican. And there's also a letter from a representative called Newt Gingrich, who's a Republican, asking for the same thing. Okay, so we thought, well, this is great. This will come in handy. We didn't know in 1994 that the Congress is going to change hands from Democrat to Republican. So we just knew we'd have these guys. We thought we'd have trouble with the Democrats, so we're going to have these Republicans to help us. Well, okay, Congress changed hands about 6 days after I was sworn in. And Newt Gingrich became the Speaker of the House of Representatives and a big enemy of President Clinton. And all these senators, except for one, when we waited to figure out when we should bring this letter out. When we finally brought it out, they first said, well, we didn't really mean it, and they kind of just oozed away, except for Senator McCain, who said, yes, Arizona would get more people. Why should I, more representatives? Why should I be against that? Because that's a big undercount state. In the meantime, I thought, well, we'll try it. Newt Gingrich, we got this letter. He thought it was a good idea. And he was very explicit about it. So I contacted Gingrich. You know, you can't contact somebody directly. I mean, I had to contact an Atlanta area congressman that I knew was Gingrich's right-hand man. And I, you know, sort of behind the scenes contacted him. And he said he'd look into it. And what they did, when they looked into it, they hired a guy who's there's 2 or 3 guys that do modeling and projections, one for the Democrats and one for the Republicans. And this is the guy the Republicans used, Clark somebody. Well, he apologized to me later. He wrote a paper saying what it would do to the Republican representation if we could correct the undercount. And what he told them, he said it wouldn't affect the Senate at all, obviously. It would probably cost them 2 seats in the Congress. But to cover himself, he said, and maybe as many as 25. So Gingrich read that, and he said, it will cost us 24 seats. And so every argument thereafter was 24 seats. That number inflated immediately from 2 to 20 to 24. That was the number they used, and they were against it. So, and this congressman called me back and told me that we're against it. Okay, we're not going to go for it. And I said, well, you know, this is going to cost us a ton of money to do with a more labor-intensive way. And he said, well, we'll get you the money. Well, of course, the appropriator, who is now the head of the whole House budget appropriations, head of the whole appropriations committee, but he wasn't giving us the money at all. And I basically said, are you going to talk to Harold Rogers? Yeah, we'll talk to Harold. Well, we still didn't get the funding we needed, but they threw money at us in 2000. That's always been their pattern. Never underfund the research, throw money at you in the year because they get scared that we won't get the people out. So they threw money at us, and we basically, I mean, it was a very successful census, and it was so successful that we actually got what we considered was a completely accurate count of the U.S. population. The only thing is, the overcount matched the undercount. We got the undercount down far enough so that it matched the overcount, so it was a wash. But of course, having more northern snowbirds counted in retirement areas of Florida and having fewer, say, Black and Hispanic people counted in inner cities wasn't exactly a wash. But it was that was what the Republicans wanted. In fact, the guy they put in charge of census oversight was from one of those seats in Florida that benefits from the overcount. So that was that. Wasn't very happy. So we did, though, make the successful census. But as I said, the 2000 census was the last one that had the long form. Through 2000, we were very concerned about the accuracy of individual items. And so income, which is the single most problematic variable, is no longer on the census. So that has eased some of our research, although we still get this on the American Community Survey, and we always joke and say Americans are more willing to tell you about their sex lives than about their income. And that's just still remains true. So I think there's over 10% non-response on income questions. Probably more now that it's on the survey. As I said, the racial and ethnic designations are still in flux, and they're going to continue. They're just going to continue. I don't know if any of you work in that field. There's some fascinating research being done out of Duke, I think it is, where the researchers have access to a large database of college students where it includes blood tests. And they've been able to identify in this sample the students whose blood test indicates that they're multiracial. And they've been able to find, I can't remember how they've done it, it's been written up in demography a couple of times. They have been able to follow up 10 years later on how these same students are identifying themselves. So they're getting a pattern, the pattern of how changes are occurring in race ethnic designations, and it's utterly fascinating. It's clearly in flux. That particular paper was, I think, in either the first or second volume of demography this year, and they presented at PA before, but it's really fascinating and in some ways a little disturbing because there is some suggestion that that there is kind of the persistence of what's called the one-drop rule. So I'm sorry to report that, but anyway, it's very interesting. Finally, well, you know there's many other examples of fluidity, such as the huge spike in Native Americans reported in the 1990 census after that movie Dances with Wolves came out. You know, there's a lot of things like that. Indians, suddenly lots of Indians in the South, because Indians of Indian ancestry thought that meant them, even though it said American Indians, you know, so on and so forth. This is ongoing. We are constantly researching this topic. And the Census Bureau does a lot of research. I know in Canada you do that too. There's a wonderful conference that you held here about 20 years ago. I still have what may be one of the few remaining copies of the proceedings. It was Canadians, Russians, Uruguay, Brazilians, US, and a few other countries that have where multi-race or multicultural is a big deal in a governmental sense. So ongoing research, never ending. Finally, I think that the fascinating thing for demographers comes from what's called the relationship question. And that's on the census. You know, we have a person one, that's the person that starts filling out the form. And then everybody else has a question of what is your relationship to person one? And we're constantly expanding the designations you can use. Like you can now do unpaid partner. Well, I remember after the 1970 census, a whole lot of some very clever people did research to figure out how many unmarried partners there were in America using the census, and I don't remember quite how they got at it, but it was pretty devious. The way that was the first estimate we ever had in the early 70s of how many people were living together and not married. So now we have unmarried partner, and we have a number of other things, but you know, again, we're always researching here. What else do we need to know? At the very time that in our census, 2000 census, that the Republicans were carrying on about the costs and our intrusiveness, they added a question. This is the senator from Kansas again, on grandparents taking care of children. So there's that always is a problem there. But for the accuracy of individual items, this relationship question, the reason we ask it is because it's a check on the completeness of the form. And so we know where here's somebody that said they were this and they were that, but there's this missing relationship person there, and then we go back and get it. That's the whole purpose of the form. But we're getting a lot of interesting information from it. So finally, political pressures. Well, I've said a lot as I've gone along, but the results of our census are more political than those of the three other censuses that are like ours: Canada, the UK, and Australia. Probably New Zealand too. I haven't checked into that, but we have always maintained relationships with Statistics Canada, with the UK, and with and the Bureau of Statistics in Australia, which is widely considered a very superior statistical agency. So we have the one thing that nobody else has, which is that after every census, the Congress is immediately reapportioned. States gain or lose seats. That's happened since 1930. That was probably the blackest period in our census history. Up until 1920, every time there was more population in a state, they all just got more seats. And they just added more seats, but the room got full. 435 seats. They said, that's it. So for 1920, somebody's going to lose seats. So we're going to shift around. Well, what happened in 1920 was the beginning of the end of the settlement going west and more farms. So the new people who'd come in the late 19th century and early 20th century had gone to big cities in the East and the Midwest and gone into manufacturing. So seats are going to be taken away from these pure, honest farmers out west and given to these dirty foreign immigrants who they're dirty because they worked in industry in the East. And Congress said no. So they did not reapportion the census. The only time they never reapportioned after the census. And they refused to reapportion until there was some control over immigration. And that took place. So between 1920 and 1930, there was a bill passed in Congress to restrict immigration to people whose national origins were like the population as it had been at its founding. Well, that wasn't going to fly because they didn't have a way to measure it. Plus, they didn't have the votes because by then you had all the Irish, the Germans, and the French and Scandinavians who were not going to vote for that. We're not going back to it just being English people get to come, a small quota for the rest. No. So they needed those votes. So at that point, the Irish became white, as a famous book is titled. And they basically figured out I can't remember, it was the 1890 census. I think it was the 1890 census that would be the representation of our national origins. And that's a black day, and there's two black days in census history. The worst one was when the Census Bureau gave information on where the Japanese Americans lived in World War II, which is used for interning them. And we did not give names or addresses, but we just said these are the census tracts where they are. And that that's a stain we will never lose. But the second worst one was a census official at the time, we're now in the 1920s. He did something that I've got to warn you all against if you're ever in any position where you're testifying with any politicians in the room. We all have a habit, I think, when people say, could you measure this? We immediately start thinking about how we do it. And we don't think to say, well, let me get back to you on this. I mean, I've done this myself many a time, and I think there are probably people in this room who have, we could do this, no, we could put this with this other thing, because we're so interested in how we would do it. But that's what the guy did on the stand, the director of the Population Division of the Census Bureau. And so when he was asked, can you tell us what the national origins of the population were in 1890? He didn't say, I don't know. He just said, well, we could do this, we could do this. So then they got the job. Well, it turned out they couldn't do it. They absolutely couldn't do it because the data wasn't there. People weren't asked the question. So what happened was, and this might be relevant to your broader situation, what happened was the Census Bureau had to say, we can't do it. And so the Congress went to what's known as the AAAS, the American Academy for the Advancement of Science. A lot of political scientists were there who turned out to be somewhat political, some of them. And so you can get scientists to go along with almost any political position if that's their politics. And they will not be the scientists in the specific field. I mean, it's like you get 100% of climate scientists who say one thing, but there are other scientists who aren't climate scientists, and they say something else, and then the politicians say, well, these scientists say. That's what happened to me with the sampling dispute we had. I had two mathematicians who were opposed to sampling, very right-wing politicians, political guys, and so that was that. I myself have been asked by legislative directors of various members of Congress saying, I need a couple of doctors who will say X. Because they don't know, politicians don't know, you've got a PhD, you're a doctor. Okay, a scientist said this. You could be in any field, and you could, and this is the way it works. And I know there's some scientists that you've got a few scientists who are outliers here. What I did, by the way, I'm going off the track here. I want to get to this important lesson learned here. But as I said, the biggest challenge is to protect the people working on the census from the politicians. So what I did, I went to the president of the Population Association of America and the president of the American Statistical Association, and I got them both to write letters to me and to the Congress about how putting the association on record as we favor this methodology. Essentially, so we could say that any doctor who came in to talk about our statistical plans being bad, no statistician, any statistician does it, they're off the reservation. And, I really tried to draw a fence around the statisticians. There was a guy from the state of Michigan. He was a state employee in the state of Michigan, and I can't remember what his position was. I think he was in transportation or something, but he was a favorite guy that they brought in to testify, a demographer. So, it's not that you can't win, but it's a big, big fight. So here's the important lesson I learned. Well, by the way, there is, before I tell you that, this is another story, which is the city of Detroit. You're probably all aware the city of Detroit, Michigan, has gone bankrupt, that its population is down to about 650,000 people from over 1 million. And I can't tell you when it's over 1 million because they put so much pressure on the Census Bureau in 1990 to make their population be over 1 million. And 80 and 90 they did. Both times they put so much pressure on that I wouldn't trust those figures, whatever the figure for the Detroit metropolitan area was in 1980 or 1990. I wouldn't want to, you don't ever want to do a data series with that. But in 2000, they had a very good mayor and a very nice mayor, Dennis Archer, later on head of the all the lawyers, American Lawyer Association. He said, well, we're going to work with you. They offered to be a guinea pig, try all the testing and this and that. He said, but we're going to sue you if we don't have 1 million people. Well, we didn't. They didn't get their 1 million people, and they haven't gotten it since. And you know what's happened. So that's what I mean about the biggest challenge is is protecting the people working on the census. In other words, everybody below the director, below me. And then I have to be the one that deals with the politicians, and it was just awful. So I always say I learned a lot I'd rather not know. But I'm just sharing some of it with you now. So here's my important lesson learned. I don't know if this can ever come in handy to anybody else, but okay. So for the 2000 census, we had these very detailed plans to use statistical sampling in the census in 2 ways. One way to truncate the non-response follow-up, and the other was to correct for the under and over count. And we actually got through the undercount and the overcount, but unfortunately, the Supreme Court gave the election to George Bush, and so the Republican came in, and so we didn't get to do it. But we had all the data to do it. And there was a lot of research that went on about that afterwards. But we also had 4 or 5 other really major innovations we were going to do, any one of which would have caused a lot of trouble politically, would have been a lot of heavy lifting. I mean, the easiest one was the one I invented, which was we're going to pay people differential pay rates and have them work at non-traditional times. We would have had trouble with that, even though it was sort of obvious, but we had a big technology purchase. It was going to be the first ever use of machines to read the forms. We estimated, we tested, but there were only, these planes were being flown as we were building them. So we weren't sure. They'd only been tested once on the Israeli census. Only 2 companies in the world that could do it, Lockheed Martin and IBM. And so we had Lockheed Martin. That was a process in itself. My nightmares all through the whole thing were about people saying I'd spent all this money on this horrible, on a gold-plated toilet seat or something. The procurement thing, but I'd hired a bunch of people from the Pentagon, or we got people from the Pentagon to come in and oversee our procurement, and it actually was squeaky clean and went fine. But that in itself was politically difficult. I had the leading African-American, I don't know what to call Wade Henderson, or what to call him. He's in charge of all of the race and ethnic groups. The advocacy groups come to see me to get as many contracts as possible for them. He wanted one of these contracts. I said, I'm sorry, Lockheed Martin or IBM. And he just kept after me. So I had to keep on going on that. Then there was another thing we were trying to get through was paid advertising. We'd never had paid advertising before. We'd had free advertising on television, but in 1990, they had the ads that were directed at young black men in Los Angeles were aired most frequently in Minneapolis in the middle of the night. So, I mean, we just had no control over, because we weren't paying, we had no control over when these ads were shown. And we did all this, and in Los Angeles, we found out that the guys these ads were aimed at, they had no idea census was going on. They hadn't heard anything about it. So paid advertising we had to do it. But the GAO asked me on the one hand to prove that paid advertising worked. And of course, as you know, there's so many other things that are involved with it, you can't prove that it worked. And so it's like the guy from General Motors said years earlier, I can tell you without paid advertising, you don't sell, but I can't tell you how much it contributes to the product. So I had to deal with that. And then I had to deal with a bunch of Hispanic members of Congress who wanted to have their friends and relatives get contracts for the advertising. And we had said, we're going to have one big advertising agency contract, that's it. And we made sure they all had subcontracts with somebody specialized in Hispanics and African Americans, in Asians, in Native Americans. That was hard to find a Native American advertising agency. And then we had, I think, one other group. And so they would come in as a body. We got presented, and this was Young and Rubicam won it, and they had their groups like this, and then we had other whatever. Well, the Hispanics didn't want me to do it that way. They said we should have contracts by state. Well, fortunately, in the same meeting, there was somebody else who said we should have them by county. Yeah, I guess his cousin probably had a county-level advertising agency. And I just had to keep saying no, no, and no, and no. That was tough. But the lesson I learned was that the sampling stuff we were asking for was so complicated. And people didn't know if they were going to, the Hispanics knew they'd benefit, but they didn't know who was going to benefit and who wasn't going to benefit. The Republicans had this idea they were losing 24 seats, so they knew that, but it was so complicated. And, they had to figure out what we were doing. Well, they were always 5 steps behind in their learning. So it kept them all so busy that we got every other innovation through. I mean, that's my big lesson. That's the lesson I learned. You know, so you might want to have a red herring sometime, but you know, if you fix everybody's attention on A, then you've got B, C, D, and E, and they're just, so we got everything, and that's why our census turned out to be so good despite losing our statistical plans. So anyway, those are the things I wanted to share with you. That's gives you sort of the outline of the whole thing, but I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments and ideas.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martha. S'il y a des questions pour elle, je vais vous passer le micro pour qu'on puisse bien faire le... Ça va avec le... Ok, parfait. Benoît.
Philip, oh no.
With or without?
Non, ça va avec le...
Okay. I loved it, all of it. The striking thing for a Canadian is the involvement of congressmen and congresswomen directly with the director of census. I don't think there's anyone from Statistics Canada in the room. But as far as I can tell, I cannot imagine the kind of dealings you had on a regular basis with politicians in Canada.
What Ivan said.
No, I mean, that's the interesting thing,
Yeah.
the difference between the political systems. Because as far as I can tell, the director of census in Canada, if he or she would have to deal with a politician, it would be the minister.
Well, remember, my position was equivalent to, roughly equivalent to Ivan Felige's position. So I was really more like the head of Statistics Canada. And because we're the agency that's closest to StatCan in the U.S. And now Ivan, I couldn't believe it. He told me he sat regularly at the table with the cabinet. Now, I never could have gotten to do anything like that. I had to work through the Secretary of Commerce.
But that was the government. It was not the Congress or our Parliament.
Right.
It's not the same kind of political dealings.
Yeah, well, I had to work. You're right, Benoit. I had to working with the government. Had to go through the Department of Commerce. And that was frustrating. I didn't have, I mean, that's why I was so jealous when I came up here and heard what StatCan could do. But that's, of course, maybe that's because you have a parliamentary system. And so the Secretary of Commerce, who at the time was a man called Ron Brown, he was a leading African-American politician. And a man who believed his job as a leader was to get the best people he could and give them the resources they need and support them. So, and he also knew that he knew where I was going. Because we talked before I went, I said, here's the 3 things I want to do. Is that okay with you? And he said, yes. So, because I wasn't going to go if we were not in sync. But he never let me meet with the president. I mean, I never met the president until after I left government because Secretary Brown wanted to make sure that it was clear that decisions I was making on my own, and I am from the technical community, and I have these professional associations as advisors, and he basically wanted to make sure that it was an arm's length relationship through the government, through the executive branch. But Congress, they've got their fingers into everything. And they'll call you up on a given day and complain about something at the same time that they're complaining they don't have the data they need to do something else.
Well, I don't know if you talk with our current chief statistician.
Who you have now?
Wayne Smith.
I did know Wayne, but that was a while back.
I don't think you would get the same kind of climate there.
I know.
There is because, for example, I sit on the National Statistics Council, and the member of the council, they used to be nominated by the minister responsible of Statistics Canada, and then at some point it was changed because it was taking too long. So now we are nominated by the chief statistician, and we report to him. So when there was the big fuss about the 2011 census, we sort of make a statement that was for the media and all that. And at the time, the chief statistician came to us and told us that we were now to report to him, and he was going to give, the message of, above. So I think that it's totally different. One question I have for you, though, about the income data. Do you do like we do now in Canada, like when we filled at the time the long form census and now the National Household Survey? We were told that if we don't want to answer all the question, we could tell them, just go look at my tax form.
No.
And an increasing proportion of people are doing that.
Very large.
Very large proportion, which is amazing because they wouldn't tell you, they don't want to tell you exactly what's their income, but if you tell them, we can go in your tax form, they say go, where you get a lot more information, which is in a way is very amazing. But it has been
very amusing, and we don't have that possibility. We do have an arrangement with the Internal Revenue Service, and we do get tax records, and we use that every year as a basis for estimating annual change in population geographically, because we get the inflow outflow. But we do not have the possibility of doing what you're doing, and that's very interesting. I would be very surprised if we could get permission to do that. Because a lot of people will say that to us. Well, why are you asking me this? It could be about anything. I've told the motor vehicles people, or I've told somebody else, just go, I've already given this information. And you understand their frustration, but we aren't allowed to do that. We are not allowed. Census Bureau can talk to more other federal databases than any other statistical agency. And I know our chief statistician tried to get something through a few years ago to increase that pool of agencies that could share administrative data. And I am not up to date on what's happening right now because I wanted to have more I wanted to use the 2000 census as a way to explore using more administrative data, which they are doing right now if we get this funding. But that was the politicians in my own house. That was the Commerce Department people that took that out. And I needed to fold on it because we were having trouble with the address list. I don't know, you probably did this at the same time, but for the 1990 census, we created the first ever digitized street map of the United States. I mean, that's the basis for all the GPS, and I would assume that's the same thing in Canada happened here. And but you have to keep updating that, and the mechanism we'd relied on for updating it for the 2000 census did not get developed or disseminated as fast as we had thought it was going to be when we budgeted. So I needed more money, and I had to give up the administrative data to get the money to work on that.
I can go ahead. You said you didn't go on internet yet, because have you checked with the results with what we're doing in Statistics Canada? Because
I bet they have.
Because we've been there in 2006 and 2011. It has been a big success.
It's
also
almost 40%.
Yeah, and it's increasing a lot, and so I'd be curious to see
we're counting on that in a big way for the 2020, but we didn't get enough. Again, it takes the funding for the research and testing. For 2010, we weren't able to. I don't know how much research we did on it, but certainly for 2000, we didn't do anything. We had enough on our plate we didn't even think about it. And I was very wary. Personally, I was wary, and I said we're not going to go there because of the privacy concerns, which are very, very big in the United States, and we've got a lot more paranoids, I think, relatively than you do. But they did research in 20. They are working on it now. I mean, the intention is to get it, and I'm sure they haven't. Their partnership with you with Stat Canada is still going on. So I'm sure they've been up here and looked at everything you do.
That's one thing, a detail that remind me when you were talking about Lockheed Martin.
Yeah.
Well, here it was very bad at some point. That was, I think, for the 2006 census when they decided to go to internet. The subcontract Lockheed Martin at the time to do that, and then there was a big fuss, and they had to pull back from that because everybody was worried that what would meant with the, I think with the Patriot Act, that would mean that the U.S. the government would have access to our data. And so that almost killed the census that year. So that's,
well, I mean, that's the sort of thing you have to constantly be aware of, where these concerns or worries are going to come from. And that's why you have advisory committees. We have what's called the Secretary's Advisory Committee, and we have people on it from the American Civil Liberties Union on it. You have the mayors, have the Population Association of America. You've got all these people, and you need to have them all in the room at the same time because they need to be able to hear each other. Benoit and then Jean-Guy.
I'm coming back on the fact that, that's Benoit first?
Yeah,
Benoit,
well, I was going to do Benoit first.
Thank you. You alluded to the Census Bureau's lawyers several times. The Census Bureau does hire lawyers?
We have career lawyers, a large legal staff. And
you have a large legal staff.
A large legal staff, and the reason is that we get sued after every census. and so they start building that, so they're constantly making sure that every decision has been documented, every I dotted, every T crossed, that everything has gone for comment and like this and this and this. And also the people who sue us are basically politicians in communities that didn't turn out to be as large as they thought they were. So they could be a little neighborhood. They could be a city. I mean, New York City sued us, I think it was 1990. And we had to go back and redo a lot of New York City at great cost. So we have budgeted into the census the money for the suits, and we have budgeted in the money we're going to have to go back and redo some of these things, and they almost never win. But we have to do the work. We get told to do it, so we want to make sure we get paid for it.
Statistics Canada doesn't even have one lawyer.
No, they
No,
don't
they do
have.
have lawyers.
That's new.
No, they always have.
Okay, we'll discuss that afterwards because I checked and they don't have any.
But you might not get sued as much as we do. I'll tell you what, this maybe is something, I don't know how you'll think about this, but I remember after one visit up here to StatCan, my undersecretary, I was reporting back and telling him this and telling him that. It was talking about the current population survey. And he said, if I had a nice country like Canada, I wouldn't have these problems either. So that's sort of our view. I mean, you guys are that's why I was so depressed to hear about, the most recent thing, because we always think, it's so much nicer here.
Since the director is a political appointee and is confirmed by Senate, do you feel that this enhances the independence of the director compared to what we saw here, a pure civil servant, which can lose his position if the minister changes his mind?
There's no black or white answer to that. If you were not if somebody's got to be the political appointee. I mean, someone, and if I had been, if we had taken somebody out of the civil service and put them in the job, then they would have, then the person above them, which is the Undersecretary of Commerce, that would be the political appointee, and they would be farther, they're not even in the same town. So they would be farther away from the people that are actually doing the work. So I think it has to be this way. The current director is wonderful. He was the director of census management when I was the director of the Bureau. He was director of the management. He's not the overall civil servant in charge of the census, but he was the number 2 guy. And he ran, and that's another reason the 2000 census worked so well. But he left after that, and it was my fault in a way because when I got there, I sent 3 senior civil servants to go to the research agencies that were getting contracts instead of us to do the big surveys. And I knew that the Bureau of Labor Statistics would happily give that contract for the current population survey to Westat or one of these other firms if they could, because I used to work there, and the director is a friend of mine, commissioner. But and I had been hearing for years all the complaints about the Census Bureau. And so I saw other agencies, Department of Education, Department of Health, going to what's called the Research Triangle, going to NORC, National Opinion Research Corporation, going to WestEd, and actually, or then otherwise are running money through the National Science Foundation, then they give it to the University of Michigan, my alma mater, to go and conduct the surveys. And I wanted to make sure we didn't lose all our survey business, because that's what we need to keep ourselves going during the, the 10-year period. So I sent 3 senior civil servants around to all these big contract agencies to interview them and figure out what they were doing that we weren't doing that we could do. And they all came back and said, well, if I felt like leaving and going to Chicago, I'd go to work for NORC. So this wonderful census manager I had, that's what he did. He went to work for NORC, and he rose to be president of NORC. And he was such a good guy that I saw him at our Population Association meetings a couple of years ago, and he gave a presentation. I said, John, I'm going to do something really terrible. The next time I get asked by a Democratic administration who should be the next director, I'm saying you, and you. You are it, and he is now the director. I mean, I didn't have to say anything, actually. Everybody else thought the same thing, and he's doing a wonderful job. So he's the 3rd time in the last 3 decades that somebody who had been a civil servant in the Census Bureau came back as the political appointee to lead it. And I myself, as Danielle said, come from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So, but we have to go away and get accustomed to understanding that there's a large array of viewpoints. And the reason the Census Bureau was losing these surveys is that the Census Bureau, it's behind barbed wire, if you've ever been there, huge security to get in there. It's in with the Naval Intelligence Agency. And people are just like this. And they spend their whole careers here and they don't have a clue. And they can scare the hell out of you when you think about it. This is why people don't like to have the civil servants talk to the press or whatever, because they don't know what they sound like when they talk. I'm a very direct person. It's hard for me to be diplomatic and political when talking in public. But so that's why it's important. And I think it is important to have the director be a political appointee. The head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics is also a political appointee, and almost all the big statistical agencies a political appointee. But they don't have terms that are co-term. They have terms that are fixed terms. So what we've been trying to do is to get a 6-year term for the Census Director, Census Bureau Director, so that it isn't that they have to leave when the new president comes in.
Yeah, great talk. You said that the situation was much better here, but I'm kind of wondering if it's the case. We still had our census long form basically hugely affected, and all the what could be done was just to resign for the chief. So I was wondering if having all those congressmen, Democrats, and all that sort of balance out in some ways, preventing the government to make like arbitrary decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because, and sometimes the weird thing is, as you know, we're being very dysfunctional right now. So we're thinking we really ought to have a parliamentary system so things could be move faster, and then you make the point, which is very well taken. Now, we were shocked, absolutely shocked when we heard what happened here. I mean, if that could happen in Canada, because we do think you're a nicer place, if that could happen in Canada, what could happen anywhere? I mean, we really could not believe it. And I was, so last night I talked to some of the folks who were here, and, it was very discouraging. But I'm going home with some weapons, because if we get a Republican elected president and we still have a Republican Congress, then the same thing is coming to us. And even in the next Congress, they're going to have to fight off the same thing that happened to you, going on the American Community Survey, going from mandatory response to voluntary response. They've got the bill all written. So I think, yeah, that's a good point, because we won't fight this. The president doesn't have to fight. I mean, he can veto it when it comes, but we can fight it with other members of Congress. And what I learned when I learned this, another thing I learned is that geography trumps party politics. And Republican side thought would be for us, Well, we still got Senator McCain, and we, you know, if they think they're going to benefit, their state is going to benefit, or their district is going to benefit, it's going to hurt. The rural areas are going to hurt. There's a whole lot of Republican congressmen that are going to come onto our side. So I think being independent and or being the way we are this awkward. I mean, it's really awkward for the director. It's just really awful. But although some of them have a zest for it, I don't. I like to sit at home with my computer and my cat and write chapters for books and things like that. But I think maybe it's a messy situation, but maybe it's better. But you are a good, bad example.
We don't feel better, though.
So sorry. Well, maybe after we've made fun of you a lot, and if in our big fight, and you know, well, look at the bad things that are happening to Canada. Maybe you could use that. Anybody else have anything they wanted to add or?
I think we need to occupy them on some other issues, and you mentioned, suggested at the end of your talks that we can do other things and they don't pay attention to it. Well, I think if there's no more questions and comments, we want to thank Martin Farnsworth and Riche for our presentation today. Thank you very much.